Wonderful. Well, thank you, Simon, for joining us today. I'm pleased to introduce Simon to you. He's joining us from Bristol Diocese, where he is part of the sort of team that's working towards NZC, as I've just learned is the new way to say it. And he's also part of the national working group that's looking at how the whole of the Church of England can achieve net zero carbon by 2030. So he's got quite a big kind of idea of what the wider church is doing, not just here in Bristol, but further abroad. So without any further ado, over to you, Simon.
Well, thank you, Phil. First thing I'll say is that you'll know from the programme that this was to be a joint presentation with Nicola Harris, and sadly Nicola can't join us today. So the bad news is that you won't be hearing from her. The dubious good news is that you'll be hearing a bit more from me. As Phil said, I'm Simon Pugh-Jones. I'm a chartered architect. I chair the Bristol DAC, that's the Diocesan Advisory Committee for the Care of Churches. And I'm a contributor to the Bristol Diocesan Sustainability Policy and Guidance Notes, and also, as Phil just said, as part of the Archbishop's Sustainability Working Group, helping the National Church on its pathway to net zero by 2030. And in that context, I want to talk about being a church that builds well. And our starting point is that we have a climate crisis that needs immediate action. And as Christians, we have, of course, the added impetus that we know it's not just the climate, it's God's creation that we need to care for. The worldwide Anglican Communion reached that very conclusion in 1984 when it adopted the 5 marks of mission, the fifth of which is to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. So addressing the climate crisis is an act of mission. That affects our church buildings, how we care for and use our existing buildings, and it affects new buildings, new churches, alterations, extensions, vicarages, schools, housing projects, city farms, everything that we build. And it's all mission. It's all part of building a church in the wider sense, building the kingdom, sharing the gospels and bringing people to know God and to deepen their faith. So if we're about building well, building bricks and mortar, and building the church in the wider sense, what might that look like in the net zero carbon world the church is aiming for? Well, before we look forward, I want to look back and set the scene for this timeline. This climate crisis is sometimes described as a post-industrial revolution event and something that we've inherited, but it's not. Yes, the beginnings of global warming started with the increased power consumption of the Industrial Revolution, but the dramatic and unprecedented spike we see on the graph now started in the 1970s. It reflects post-war growth in mass production, in car ownership, in our use of steel and concrete. It reflects shifts in lifestyle and expectation, adopting central heating set at 20 or more degrees that sees us heating rooms that we aren't even using. It reflects our complacent consumption of goods and food from around the world, our love of flying around the world for business or holidays, our use of pesticides, plastic packaging, ozone-depleting chemicals, and so on. The climate crisis is, to a large degree, something that has happened in our lifetimes, and it's something that we need to address. And doing so is going to require us to change our 20th and 21st century habits. But the terms church and rapid change don't often appear together. As Christians, we're not known for immediate action. How many Christians does it take to change a light bulb? Well, the answer used to be, we don't do change. But in relation to climate, we have to. The church is going to have to change. And that's going to be really hard, isn't it? Well, let's look forward. What might the church look like in 2030? How painful is this transition going to be? And I'll start with buildings. And I see our buildings producing a fraction of the carbon they do now. All low energy light bulbs, better insulation, better draft proofing, churches with sustainable heating systems, some low carbon, some zero carbon, heat pumps, solar thermal, biomass, geothermal, and electric heating via solar panels or via green electricity or heating via green gas. I see church building projects that include only sustainable and locally sourced materials, that include passive and active sustainability as part of their designs. And I see church buildings that are used more, not just there for a modest congregation on a Sunday morning, but utilised every day. And churchyards and gardens, more wildlife, pollinators, birds, flowers, composting, ponds, benches, fruit trees, and cultivation. And wider church land, good, meaningful use, housing for people who most need homes, schools, energy harvesting, offsetting, and urban and rural farms. And since the church is not the building, but the people, what about the people? I see people who care more about how they travel, how they eat, how they consume products. I see people who today are our children and youth, coming to adulthood, becoming leaders, and become fully engaged in a church that feels relevant and on the case. I see parishes galvanised in common mission to care for the planet. I see parishes engaging with their neighbouring churches in energy cooperatives, sharing experience and resources. Parishes better connected with their communities and with secular organisations in a common human ambition to look after the world better. So I see buildings cared for and caring for the environment, but most of all, I see us building a better church. And that's the critical bit. I see us doing this. Let us not wonder when the church is going to make all these things happen, because the church is us. And if you still want to hold out for the institution of the church to facilitate change, you're too late. The national church is already overflowing with policy commitments, guidance, initiatives, resources, and support. Yes, some of the practical steps are not easy, but they're possible. And some are really, really easy, and we can do them now. For just one example, ditching a church's gas boiler for a zero carbon one costs a lot more money, and it's just harder to make happen. But keeping your boiler for a little longer, but switching to green gas or green electricity is easy. There is little or no premium on switching to green electricity, and currently about 24% premium on switching to green gas, but that's coming down fast. And yes, that's still burning something and emitting carbon and combustion gases, but it's like biomass. It's gas made from carbon absorbing materials, and in terms of direct carbon, it counts as net zero. And if your church hasn't switched energy provider for a while, you may be on a higher cost tariff than you should be anyway. So you could even switch to green and save money. The process is just like switching at home, and it costs you nothing. And if you want to know how easy, get in touch and I'll help you. Factor in scale too. In a single average sized church using fossil fuel, it will generate around about 5,000 kilograms of CO2 from heating in 1 year. And if you include all harmful emissions in what's termed CO2e, a specific definition, that goes up to more like 20,000 kilograms. So decarbonising makes a real change. That's 20 tonnes every year. And the Church of England has 16,000 churches. And there are over 40,000 churches of all denominations in the UK. Most Anglican churches are autonomous charitable trusts, so these decisions are down to each of them. But every one that takes a step forward towards net zero can then share that expertise with other churches around them. It's a bit like doing a tax return. If you do it with someone who's done it before, it's much easier. Then 1 becomes 10, becomes 100, and suddenly green tariffs for churches and low carbon solutions for churches become a big shift in demand for the industry. Availability goes up and costs and tariffs come down. And those 100 churches become 1,000 churches, and we feel like we're part of something amazing, that we're making a difference, like we want to wear the T-shirt and tell everybody about this big creation care mission we're on. Some of the other practical steps we might take used to be less than easy, but they are easier now. 10 years ago, putting solar panels on your church roof was likely to be seen as controversial, and you may not have got the permissions that you needed. But that's now changed. DACs, planning authorities, and statutory consultees, such as Historic England, will still want to ensure that solar panels don't harm our historic churches, and the aim would be that at first glance you don't see them. But at second glance you might see them, and if you do, that's a very good thing too. After all, we measure the history of our churches by their moments of change. The Reformation, new additions to accommodate growing congregations, the changes of the Georgian era or the Victorian era. And often those changes represent some kind of societal shift. So if there was ever a reason to make changes today, it seems reasonable to me to make changes because of a societal shift in the face of an existential threat. Changing churches is also saying, look, even this beautiful Grade 1 listed building is playing its part. And that in turn is challenging any idea that the church is behind the times on the critical issues of our day. And we know that if you ask children and young adults what they think the church should focus on, they will have the environment top of that list. So if your church is thinking, can we really manage to stretch to spending funds on decarbonising? Then remember to factor in the mission benefit of having renewed appeal to the next generations. They will be the ones who in 2030 and beyond are saying either how proud we are to be part of this church, or what on earth were they thinking in 2021 when they didn't act. They and their children will be the ones who look back at us now and marvel at our intransigence in still burning fossil fuels, importing food from the other side of the world, consuming single-use plastics, and all the crazy things we still do today. So what is ahead of us is exciting, but not without its challenges. But when we get going, it's going to be good, isn't it? When we can follow others, we'll all be on board. Any minute now, we'll be ready to start. Well, yes, but actually we have started. In Bristol alone, we have an eco-champions network, creating connections and promoting the environment in their parishes. We have over 70 parishes on the Arosha Eco Church scheme, and those that have already been accredited now glowingly proud to say that they are award-winning eco churches. We have prayer and liturgy resources for parishes and individuals. We have a diocesan environmental officer. We have a diocesan bishop who has just been appointed as one of 2 national bishops for buildings. We have a DAC that is proactive in helping parishes make change and get on board with reducing their carbon. And we have a wealth of resources available to help under almost every topic you can think of. And that's just our diocese. Nationally, the same is happening in every diocese and being supported by an ever-growing list of national resources in terms of guidance, research, tools, people, and money. It's already started. We're already decarbonising. Every church that joins the pathway to net zero joins a growing mission movement and makes it easier to bring other parishes along too. It's not what we're going to have to do, it's what we're doing already, and already reaping the rewards, carbon rewards and mission rewards. This thing that started in the 1970s has gone too far. As I grew up in the 70s, being environmentally conscious and wanting to make things better was enough to mark you out as a bit of a weirdo. In my case, they may have had a point, because I very much like the fact that in March 1970, Kermit the Frog first sang "It's Not Easy Being Green," a song in which he concludes that green is beautiful and it's what he wants to be. I'm glad that 50 years later, we all see that being green is beautiful, and we're doing something about caring for the beautiful world that God created, and that's enriching our faith. It's giving us better buildings and gardens and transport choices and diets and lifestyles. But it's also real, proper mission. It is truly building the church well. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Simon. So much to chew over there, but also just so much inspiring me. Um, I love the connection that you drew with mission and the fact that you pointed out to us that this isn't just a responsibility in terms of, our responsibility to the earth and to one another, but it's mission and it's part of a responsibility to God to join Him in His mission. So I also loved that image of the solar panels on the church roof that you don't see at first, but on second glance you might see them, and actually that's a good thing. So yeah, thank you for everything you've shared. If it's all right with you, we'll just take some questions now. So if anyone's got any questions, then feel free to put them into the chat. As we did this morning with Justin, it's helpful if you put question at the start just to draw attention to it. So Martin asks, is there a best first thing in our parish can do to start the journey?
I would choose something easy, and what that is will vary from parish to parish. So as a DAC, we will quite often visit parishes and ask questions about, I mentioned energy tariffs. Are you on a green energy tariff? It's 9 clicks. It's really easy. One of the ones that a lot of parishes will do as their first step is just have a look at the Arosha website, download the form for EcoChurch and have a go. Because first of all, you'll probably be surprised how good you are already. But I think also that, let's say you do that and you get to bronze, or with a few adjustments, maybe a couple more LED light bulbs or something like that, you can suddenly find that you're accredited as a bronze EcoChurch. The next thing you'll do is say, how do we get to silver? And you've given yourself an identity as a church that's now galvanized around this mission objective. So when the next conversation of, well, why don't we do something else? Why don't we look at something more challenging, like maybe the solar panels or changing the heating or any number of things that that may be appropriate for your church? That's a lot easier because everybody's on board. Everybody feels part of something. And we see that a lot in parishes. It's that, make that first step, because then when you've made the first step, you're on the journey. And it's much easier you're on your way. It's much easier to do the other things and to take on the tougher challenges.
Fantastic. Next, we have a question from Adrian, who says, thank you for a really interesting presentation. You said a lot about buildings, but less about land. What role does carbon sequestration, I can't say that word, sequestration through tree planting, peatland restoration, etc., have on church lands play in the C of E's goal for NCZ?
That's a huge topic. The good news is that the National Working Group is all over it and very conscious that where we have been historically hasn't been good enough. So on offsetting, one of the challenges with offsetting is that offsetting in the UK is nothing like as successful or beneficial in terms of carbon as offsetting in some African nations, for example. But then it becomes a bit abstract. It becomes a sort of theoretical thing that you get a certificate and it's, you can say you've offset, but it doesn't feel like you've done anything. In Bristol, we don't have huge land holdings, but the church collectively has quite a lot of land. And one of the actions coming out of the national work is to make sure we look at that a lot harder, so that we can, for example, if we have land that's lower grade agricultural land, doesn't really lend itself to anything in particular, but actually could be the basis of a significant tree planting scheme. Whilst that is less successful from a carbon point of view, that feels like a very good use of land because it's tangible. and it's something that you could visit without having to fly to Africa. Yeah, and I mean, that's just a couple of examples, but the myriad of different ways that you could make better use of land. And that's not just the national holdings, that's individual churches with a bit of land, either that they've just got, or it might be a church hall that's perhaps run down and want to work out what to do with it. There are lots and lots of different examples where land can be a significant factor, and of course not just in terms of carbon credits, but also in terms of adding biodiversity. I mean, it leads me straight to Hazelnut Community Farm, of course, and the things that they're doing, and really takes it back to exactly that point, that if you can use land in an appropriate and positive way, suddenly turns out that that's mission.
Again, coming back to that M word, I love it. So Natasha is wondering what you know about the progress of other dioceses compared to Bristol. You said quite a lot about how we're doing. Do you know if there's any difference between urban dioceses and rural dioceses? What's the kind of national picture?
The one word answer is varied. Dioceses and DACs vary enormously, partly in their makeup and the expertise they have available, partly in their geography and whether they are predominantly urban or rural. We're quite lucky in Bristol. We're a relatively small diocese. We have 220 something churches, and a fantastic resource in terms of expertise available. So we can be quite proactive and persuasive about getting churches to move forward. Some of the, I think particularly the Derbyshire dioceses, which are huge, have just such a workload in dealing with everyday maintenance issues that it's difficult for them to go beyond being reactive to what comes in and being proactive and going out to parishes and rattling cages and promoting sustainability. So there is variance, and again, that's something that the work that's going on nationally is, I won't say levelling up because that's a horrible political phrase, but making it a bit easier so that we focus resources where that resource isn't at the moment, and where we can lead the way. And just something to say on that is that, as I said in my presentation, once you've got in every diocese 1, 2 or 3 churches that have done these things, that have decarbonised their heating or put solar panels on, have become gold eco churches, then they become the most precious resource, because they're the ones with the frontline expertise of how they did it. So I think that's a very important part of it as well. So national resources being fed in from the national church, encouraging all dioceses and DACs to be as equal as they can in promoting the cause. And then it all gets a lot better when we have exemplar churches across the country.
Wonderful. Now, I know that I just want to acknowledge, for those of you that aren't part of the Church of England, that there's been a lot of talk of dioceses and church councils and PCCs and things. But hopefully this has still been, very much relevant to you in your context, whatever that might look like. Here at Hazelnut, we are part of the Church of England, and that's our context. But hopefully everything that we've been talking about in this conference and this afternoon here in this seminar can be applied into your context, especially anything that's to do with, as Simon keeps saying, about mission, to do with our mission here to decarbonize being actually part of our wider mission as Christians. Before we just finish, I just wanted to acknowledge, Arnold, your question about offsetting. Simon, I know you've answered quite a lot about carbon offsetting. Is there any final thing you'd like to say about offsetting, say with climate stewards or anything like that?
That we already have links. Again, this is a slightly Church of England answer, but yes, we already have links to climate stewards. And again, just they're absolutely brilliant. Making that connection, that it's not just planting trees somewhere, it's planting trees and doing so in a positive way, actually sort of linking that up. So that connection is very strong. They're based in the southwest anyway, so happens that they're good friends. But very much support that connection, and sort of link that to your previous point. We're the Church of England. We're working through our own strange governance arrangements and prone to using Church of England terminology. But if you take the terminology out, it's all about faith. It's all about God's creation. And what I am constantly delighted by is that that's cool if you're having a conversation with a secular organisation. When on other topics, and certainly other matters of faith, you've got to kind of get over that, well, we're the church thing. But the connections that we are, as a Church of England, making with other churches and other denominations and with secular organisations, it's so easy and so right, because it's a common goal. There are very few people who think it's it's all a fraud. Most people, the vast majority of people, are up for a serious conversation about caring for the planet. I'm completely happy that for us it's that extra bit, that it's not just the planet, it's God's creation.
Excellent. Thank you, Simon. And there was a thumbs up there from Arnold. So thank you for that answer and for everything you shared with us. We're going to end the recording here. And if you need to slip away quickly to another seminar, enjoy that. But do stick around if you're staying for our final one.